As we begin today, don't forget that a week from tomorrow is when the source selection assignment is due. So make sure to be looking at that on Blackboard. Make sure to be gathering your sources. You need to have 5 to 7 sources related to your topic. Again, if you switch topics, that's fine. Just make sure to note that when you turn those sources in. You can submit that information to me either by Blackboard or by email, but make sure to review the assignment so you know what to include and what to make sure to, because you also need to talk about your process in finding the sources and some other things that you will want me make sure that you complete. The other thing is that I hoped to have the study guide up by today, but I do not have it up. I hope to have it up by Monday. That way it will give you at least 2 weeks to prepare for the midterm. But we'll say more about that on Monday. But the midterm coming up within 2.5 weeks, so don't forget about that. We are in the midst of talking about the 18th century. One other event I want to finish up with from the 18th century before moving on to talk about culture and society and the way that Christianity interacted with the various cultures that it existed in the 18th century. And that's to talk about the French Revolution. On Monday, we had talked about the revolution that resulted in the creation of the United States. Some similar types of things behind the French Revolution, at least the rhetoric of freedom and liberty and equality. But there are some differences regarding how these were carried out, how these revolutions were carried out, as well as some other things that were moving towards revolution. Throughout the 18th century, economic conditions deteriorated in France. It was not a good time economically. And as you are all aware from the past several years in the 21st century here, that as economic tensions increase, there are tensions that increase between other groups of people. It's not just an economic thing. It transfers over into how we talk about, view others. And so in the 18th century France, as the conditions are worsening, there's a lot of tension existing between the clergy, the ministers, the predominantly priests in France, and the nobles. There are tensions between the nobles and the commoners, as you would expect with economic conditions. And then there were also tensions between the commoners and the church ministers. And so out of all of this, a wave of violence starts sweeping through. The people of Paris riot to essentially show their opposition predominantly to the king, taking even the Bastille, which was a prison for the king's enemies. Ultimately, the National Constituent Assembly, which is an organization that develops out of the French Parliament, arises. And it issues a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And here are just some of the things that are stated in that document. It says that people are born and remain free and have equal rights. Now, this, of course, is quite unusual in a situation where you have a monarchy, as many of the places in Europe did still at this time. But the emphasis is on equal rights, freedoms. Furthermore, it states, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Right? So liberty, true liberty, is being able to do whatever you want, provided it doesn't cause someone else injury. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limit except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. Right? And so as long as you're not hurting anybody else, you have freedom to do whatever you want. Furthermore, related to the issue of religion, the Declaration stated, quote, "No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, So we have here kind of a statement of religious freedom, but note how it's described. It's described as opinions, right? And so you might have a different opinion on religion than I do, but we are all allowed, according to the Declaration of Rights, to communicate those, express those, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Right? And so as long as you are not disturbing the public, you can have your own religious views, even if they might disagree with whatever religious view is in power. The freedom of communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen may, accordingly, speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. And so you can communicate it, but if it leads to consequences, or if it leads to certain things, you may face some consequences. And so the idea coming out of this document was to try and establish freedom, and a variety of freedoms, including freedom of religion and the freedom to communicate. When this document reaches the king refuses to accept it. He refuses to support it, which causes the Paris populace to riot again. Out of that as well, this National Constituent Assembly, another document is released related to the clergy, the civil constitution of the clergy. Now, remember, France had received some freedoms in Catholicism that other nations didn't enjoy. And so this is related to some of those freedoms. But the National Constituent Assembly decides it should make sure to regulate the bishops, make sure that they follow certain laws. Quote, no church or parish of France or any French citizen may acknowledge upon any occasion or upon any pretext whatsoever the authority of an ordinary bishop or of an archbishop whose see is the place where they are in charge, shall be under the supremacy of a foreign power, nor that of his representatives residing in France or elsewhere. Without prejudice, however, to the unity of the faith, in the intercourse which shall be maintained with the visible head of the universal church as hereafter provided. What does that all mean? Well, essentially the idea is that the French Catholics, French citizens, were not to be able to appeal to the authority of other bishops, leaders outside of France or past the assembly. Now, there is some recognition here, yes, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, but ultimately what it's trying to do is make sure that the French bishops are not appealing to other powers and essentially destabilizing France. Note also that they claim, quote, beginning with the day of publication of the present decree, the Civil Constitution, there shall be but one mode of choosing bishops and parish priests, namely that of election. Now, the traditional way that bishops were appointed was by the Pope. And so it was a top-down. The Pope decided who was going to be the bishop, and then the priests were chosen by the bishops. But now it's turned. And so the French government is saying, the people have the right to determine this. There is no way that the Pope makes decisions in France about its bishops. And then there were also some other regulations about salaries and restrictions regarding clergy at various levels. As you might expect, the Pope, who was Pius VI at the time, condemns the document because it curtails his authority, which was related to the appointing of bishops. Louis XVI, who was the king at the time, tries to keep a lot of this secret, but ultimately he agrees with the assembly, finds himself in support of it, but kind of conditions it upon if the Pope supports it. Ultimately, all the clergy were expected to agree to it or be removed from their positions. In the midst of all this, that we're talking about, we're moving through the 18th century. In the midst of all this, 7-Year War erupts, right? And so France gets involved in this dispute between Prussia and Austria over the Holy Roman Empire. France is in the midst of losing this war. We talked about on Monday how it loses a lot of its colonies in North America. And out of this, it's decided to abolish the monarchy. The king is convicted of treason and executed. Rebellion, revolution, and terror flowered. It was all over France. And the enemies of the revolution faced the guillotine. And the leadership that arises is sometimes referred to as the Reign of Terror. Now, many of the revolutionaries, the people at the forefront of this, were very anti-religious. It wasn't just that they were against the monarchs, against the bishops, they were just against religion in general. And believed themselves to kind of be the epitome of thinkers of science and reason. And that they had come to these conclusions through reason, that they were philosophers and were caught up with the superstitions of the religious. But they also believed that there was a need to have something to replace religion, to replace the Catholic Church, which was also kind of taken out of power as well. And so the cult of reason was established in France. Essentially a civic religion. Because it was understood by these people, these revolutionaries, that there still needed to be that social organization that served the function of religion. And so the cult of reason was to provide communal ties, hold people together and hold them to France, but remove all what they consider the superstitious elements of religion. Right? Deities, anything supernatural, the idea of revelation. All of these things were to be done away with. Although it's presented as the cult of reason, and reason was to accept everyone's opinions, it ultimately led to persecution, imprisonment, and death, largely because many of the priests and nuns who stayed in France refused to swear before the altars of freedom. Right? And so altars of freedom were established, and so it was there is kind of this religious standpoint to it. Eventually, the Reign of Terror dies down, and Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power. In the midst of all this, as he's taking power, he wants to hold on to some of the notions of democracy and liberty, but he also wants to negotiate and reconcile with the Catholic Church. And so, as he is gaining power, he helps promulgate the Concordat of 1801, which essentially gave the Catholic Church back some of its civil status. Catholicism this time is noted as the religion of the majority of French people, but it is no longer the state religion. Where prior to this point, prior to the Revolution, it had been the state religion. Now it's kind of, yes, most French are Catholic. The French state still was in charge of nominating bishops, but the church could decide to remove those bishops if there was something wrong with them. From the Concordat, quote, "Before assuming their functions, the bishops will take directly at the hands of the first consul," which is the title Napoleon starts off with. "They will take the oath of loyalty used before the change of government, expressed in the following terms." Right? So they have to present themselves and take an oath that they will be loyal to the government of France. And so here's the oath. "I swear and promise before God on the Holy Scriptures to observe obedience and loyalty to the government established by the Constitution of the French Republic. I also promise to have no dealings, to attend no council, to converse with no group, whether within or without, which would be contrary to the public peace, Right? So again, there's that concern of religion's okay as long as it doesn't interfere with the public order. And if in my diocese or elsewhere, I learn that something is being plotted to the detriment of the state, I will make it known to the government. Right? So you have to swear loyalty to the government. You have to make sure that anything you do is for the public peace, public order, and essentially you kind of have to be a spy as a bishop. Right? If you hear of people plotting against the government, you have to make it known. Or if you hear they're plotting something that's going to be detrimental or disturbing to the government, you have to let them know. And as we can kind of see, as we think about recent developments within the past decade or so in France, this idea of religion and the public order has found its expression in a variety of things in a more secular France, such as banning religious headgear, religious symbols, all in the name of public peace and public order. The last thing that is interesting out of this document of 1801 is that a prayer in the following form, and this is a quote, a prayer in the following form will be repeated at the end of the divine office. The divine office referred to the Mass, the observance of communion, and kind of a worship service. So a prayer at the end of the worship service in all Catholic churches in France. God save the Republic, God save the consuls. Right? And so essentially making Mass, the central practice of Catholicism, have political overtones. Right? You're praying for the Republic, you're praying for the leader. Eventually, Napoleon maneuvers his way into becoming emperor. The Pope at the time, Pius VII, comes to his coronation, right, and is ready to, as most popes did, crown him as emperor, crown him as royalty. And as he's getting ready to crown him, Napoleon turns around, takes the crown from him, and puts it on his own head. And it's kind of this: I'm not beholden to the Pope. I am an authority separate and distinct from the Pope. As we see here in the 18th century with these political events that we've been looking at, there's a lot of ways in which Christianity is losing its political power in a variety of ways. Still will maintain a lot of cultural power, and in the United States especially will have a lot of political power as well. But here we have this kind of developing secularism, with a more and more emphasis being placed on Christianity and religion in general being a private matter. Right? This is not something for the public sphere. This is not something for the political sphere. And it is something that must be a part of good moral order.